Hey everyone, I'm here with Adam. We are here on a Tuesday, it's a Tuesday evening, and I just read the book Easy Riders and Raging Bulls. I read a lot of that book. And so we're going to talk about the 70s. We've previously come to some fisticuffs and blows about our assessment of the decade, so I'll rehash that a little bit. Um, and I should also note that, Adam, that I haven't seen a single Francis Ford Coppola film or anything by Peter Bogdanovich in this decade. I saw one Godfather film, so I'm not suggesting that but it was the wrong Godfather film. So I'm not suggesting that I've seen everything, but I'm going to base it off the stuff that I have seen in the 70s. I take it you have read that Easy Rider Raging Bull book as well.
Yes, m many years ago, so I don't have a fresh memory of it. But yeah, yes, actually, I read it a couple of times, I think.
Um, Before reading the book, I had somewhat of a clear idea of what the 70 was in film. So I'm going to put forth a definition of what the 70s is and what a 70s movie is. And I'm going to say, Adam, do you agree or disagree with it? And you could, contest it. So
Okay.
there are 70s films that actually happened in the 60s. I don't think it's a decade, but if it's a purely decade by decade film phenomenon. I think The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, and Easy Rider were spiritually 70s films because they covered the same themes. Then I think that the 70s are known, I don't think necessarily true, but they're known for being a decade of directorial signatures. They're known for having more of a social message element. They have a theme of a fairly overriding theme. One thing Peter Biskin said is that the way the film was made usually goes into the film itself, and these filmmakers who were making these films were often running against the current of big studios and trying to do things a different way. So it feeds into this theme of like one generation trying to establish themselves from under the gaze of the generation before them. And it also refers, I believe, to a certain number of filmmakers, Brian De Palma, William Friedkin, Hal Ashby, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, sort of Spielberg and Lucas, but I think their output was a little bit different. It didn't really feel like the 70s, and you could also say Robert Altman. You had guys like George Roy Hill and Sidney Lumet who were making films in this decade, or Bob Fosse, but they didn't necessarily hang around with the other guys. They were, even Sam Peckinpah was like a holdover from the 60s. And lastly, you had exposition was pretty minimal. A lot of films like China Syndrome, All the President's Men, Dog Day Afternoon, French Connection, you didn't really need the people there wasn't much exposition, it was way more action. It's not like the people coming into those films were asking, what was this character's childhood like? It wouldn't really matter to All the President's Men. You just had two guys jumping in there, which is kind of funny because the Elia Kazan generation must have really been well. We'll discuss that. I'm not sure how it fits in with the greatest actors of this who were in the 70s actually. Um, Al Pacino. That's and one of the good things probably that I think I will agree with is that you had a generation of actors: Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman, Harvey Keitel, and Robert Duvall. That was like kind of changing the game as well. And the generation of actors before that, Gregory Peck and Sidney Poitier, was a little more of a classic approach. Those are the people that kind of dominated the 60s, right? So Peter O'Toole, Richard Burton. I apologize, babble too much. But, which parts of that do you agree or disagree with?
Okay, well, it's a lot to unpack. I mean, I think I agree with much of what you said. The 70s was kind of this perfect storm of, the studio system, the old studio system having been overtaken. The companies that own the studios didn't really know what to do, so they started giving freedom to a lot of directors that we call our tour directors, And then at the same time, you had this group of new faces, new viewpoints with the directors that you mentioned, along with some old hands that you also mentioned, that really kind of took advantage of the opportunity to do a lot of personal films, a lot of groundbreaking films. Uh, Not all social issues, although you certainly had it had your share of that. But there's also experimentation, both in terms of story structure, in terms of technology. Um, so it's my favorite decade of film. It's not that I think that that all '70s films are terrific, but it's kind of it's the one that I go back to. That decade is really has and continues to inspire directors working today, such as Paul Thomas Anderson or Alexander Payne, along with a few remaining veterans of the '70s, such as Scorsese and Spielberg. Um, but in terms of exposition, it depends on the film. You're right, a film like All the President's Men, yeah, you don't learn about Woodward and Bernstein's childhood. Um, Other films kind of worked it in gradually, like Dog Day Afternoon. You don't know their background at first, but eventually you find out a little bit more about Sonny Al Pacino character's life before, based on his conversations. So yeah, it wasn't all set up in a classical way that it may have been done, in the '40s and '50s.
I think, yeah, and so if we go, I guess the next point I was going to make, actually, because if you think about it, the major kind of revolution was like the Brando generation in the 50s. Brando, Karl Malden, even I think Cloris Leachman was in the school, so like that actors studio with Stella Adler and Elia Kazan.
Yes, yes, in
Without
terms of
having,
acting,
without
it
having,
was, and that carried over to the '60s. People like Paul Newman and Steve McQueen were, yeah, obviously they had their own styles, but they were largely kind of in that tradition that started in the '50s. For lack
really.
of a better term, the method.
I thought Steve McQueen was more of a Rob. I thought Steve McQueen and Paul Newman were more like I didn't study acting. I was just like some of those early guys from the 30s were just they were just hanging around the studio lots and just kind of got cast. Everyone kind of who was good looking got cast in the 30s. I would not have guessed that Paul Newman had studied at the Actors Studio.
Oh, he did.
I
Yeah,
know
back.
Harvey Keitel did, and he's in the 70s.
Yeah, one of Paul Newman's first big breaks. Somebody up there likes me. James Dean was rumored to have had that role before his untimely death, and then Paul Newman stepped in.
Yeah, so I guess my curious is how well, considering I haven't seen Coppola. I'm curious, like, how did guys like Robert Duvall, his best film was Tender Mercies, well, according to Stephen Colbert, but how did he even like, how was he even feeling like he was being used, even in a great film like Network? There's no, Robert Duvall was a method actor too, if I'm not mistaken. He said, how was he even enjoying the 70s? When I feel you're right. I haven't seen them all, but I there's a great number of films I've seen that I felt like were very short on character. I actually think Jack Nicholson, all the films that I've seen with him actually are very rich in character, but I'm not sure exactly how. I wonder if how the Elia Kazan generation reacted to being in the 70s, where a lot of these scripts didn't call for like really deep explorations, the way that like Cool Hand Luke or like you know, even the Sandpiper with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor was like very emotional. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it depends on the actor.
Yeah.
Uh, just you mentioned The Godfather, and there, you had this confluence of, Brando, who was an actor that so many other actors looked up to, and then you have other people like, Pacino and Duvall you mentioned, and then you have De Niro and the second one that kind of, take it and move it to the next level. I mean, I think you did have a lot of films that had character exploration, but again, it depends on the film. But certainly Taxi Driver, just name on it off the top of my head. I mean, there is a lot of character exploration in that. In fact, that probably this is probably more of that than there is story.
Yeah, I would say that a middle ground might be Marathon Man, which it kind of shoehorns the story in the end. That Dustin Hoffman meets his brother, and it kind of unleashes his fears. But it's kind of a little, it's like second half like character development. Um, that's an interesting movie. Despite my general feeling towards the 70s is that I am a little, I would say my reaction is a little bit less. In terms of Taxi Driver, I think it's kind of a classic. I think it's stuff that I like it quite a bit, probably not as much as people love it. Because of the style, I think a lot of the style is pretty low. It's a little bit of it doesn't. It's a little lower exposition at the start, and I guess some people might call that en media res, which means you start the story with the action. Um, but I guess I can mention that there are a few films that I really love from this era. I really love Network, obviously. Chinatown is at the top. And Network, I think, is the ultimate 70s movie. It's very action oriented. It's like a Aaron Sorkin show, but it's got some great dialogue, great scenes. I also love Five Easy Pieces. Five Easy Pieces is it's devoid of character at the start, but then you fully understand the person. I think Norma Ray is also a perfect movie because it's primarily about action, but you really get to know Norma Ray and the two big people in her life. Also, I mean, I can also point to American Graffiti. The films of Spielberg and Lucas, I think, are actually not spiritually 70s film, even though those two film guys hung around the other guys often. I also would say that if there's one auteur that I really appreciate, I think it's Robert Altman, who every one of his films. I've seen five films of his from this decade, and they're all very interesting and thought-provoking. I think, if anything, Taxi Driver is very thought-provoking, if nothing else, and I can appreciate that a lot about the film. I love a thought-provoking film, so I think that's also an element that might have been missing from some of the other 70s films like Dog Day Afternoon or Marathon Man. Like, what's there so much to think about in Dog Day Afternoon? It's just a heist film.
Well, I don't. I mean, it's a heist gone wrong. I mean, I love Dog Day Afternoon, and kind of in right away you see that this is going to be different when there are three men in the crew robbing the bank, and one of them immediately panics and leaves. And so right from the first couple of minutes, okay, this is going to be different. These are not expert criminals that are going to pull off a sophisticated robbery. These are people that are already in over their head, and it's really not even about the robbery so much as kind of what the robbery creates and the fact and just the desperation that these two criminals have, and that it kind of extends to their hostages.
I'm glad that you can see that it deserves to be a great movie in someone's eyes. Um, I think that the thing for me about the 70s, other than the films I mentioned, also of course also being there, I love the disaster films, the Airplane, of course, and Airport and Poseidon Adventure. There's probably a longer list. But you also introduced me to The Sting and The Great Waldo Pepper, so I'm not sure where that. Although you feel free to comment about whether that you feel that those are quintessential 70s films or whether they're a relic of an earlier decade.
Um,
Because Paul Newman's more of a 60s star, I think.
yeah, but Paul Newman, I mean, his banner decade was the 60s, and the 70s were kind of hit and miss for him. And then he actually had, for lack of a better term, a comeback in the 80s. The Sting, I think, has certainly owes a debt to to some of the films of the 30s and 40s, but I think has a different slant on it. It certainly has a little sex, has some violence, and it has just like Bonnie and Clyde, in some ways is a tribute to the 1930s gangster films, but they could do a lot more in terms of violence. I also thought the screenplay is structured in a very clever way. Um, I mean, the 70s, there's no one definition of a 70s film. 70s, one of the things I love about the decade is that there's a variety of different films, a variety of different visions. Uh, and people can make out of that what they will. You mentioned the disaster movies. I'm not that big a fan of the disaster movies, but people love them. Uh, uh, people to this day love the Towering Inferno and the Poseidon Adventures. So hey, that's great.
So I would say that I would also say that yeah, I mean that is true, but I think it is fun to sort of find a semi-definition, or to sort of figure out exactly what the decade is about. Adam, am I supposed to call on you like I'm the school teacher? Because
I don't know. I don't know how that got. I didn't
it's
touch
okay.
it.
You just
Yeah.
go to rehab
Yeah,
and
no,
you
I
lower
don't
your
know how
volume.
that.
Adam,
Yeah,
I
I
see your hand.
literally do
Okay.
not know how that happened.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess I'd point out that violence and sex were actually pretty big in the decade before. I guess I also want to mention the one thing about the 70s that I think I find less, but it doesn't apply for every film. Like it mutes my reaction to something like The Taxi Driver or Marathon Man, but I still can find stuff to appreciate in those films. Is the over reliance on on this sort of narrative of we're a generation that's rebelling against the generation above us, which carried over behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. And it's probably also mythologized by the context of just how wild some of these people were in relationship to the generation before them. But if you don't know how exciting the behind the scenes stories are, and you're just watching the films, and you take away the context, I think these films are less timeless than the mainstream film appreciation community does. I think French Connection is little more than just a movie about a car chase. I think that, I think I'd rather watch Steve McQueen's Widows or Two Guns rather than Dog Day Afternoon for excitement because they're all heist films. You would say that Dog Day Afternoon has more, perhaps, context in its time, but I feel like so many films from the 60s strike me as more timeless. Um, I mean, there are a lot of films like Shampoo, even the ones that I like Five Easy Pieces or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that are overly reliant on the context of one generation trying to displace another, that it requires me to be like I have to take a history lesson on the 70s just to understand it. And a lot of great 60s films like Lawrence of Arabia, To Kill a Mockingbird, Ship of Fools, Judgment of Nuremberg, Birdman of Alcatraz. So many films that I love from that Manchurian Candidate. I don't know if just I just watched Children's Hour and The Collector and They Shoot Horses, Don't They? I don't think any of those films require me to be tuned into that very moment in time when the film was made. So they are more timeless to me. What do you think, Adam?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly there are a lot of 1970s films that are dated. That if you watch them now, may may feel like relics, but then again, they're films, of the '80s or even the '90s that feel like you really need to understand what's going on in that time. But I think the best films of the '70s, you don't need you don't need a lot of context. It can help, it can add to it. The Godfather, for instance. If you know about the attitudes of the '70s, it can certainly help. But even if someone knew nothing about the '70s, the themes um, of criminality, of loyalty, of family, I think can resonate regardless. Dog Day Afternoon, I think so too. Um, just because of the desperation, kind of the comedy. There's a lot of the movie that's funny. Taxi Driver, I think is relevant to today. The difference is, and I'm hardly the first person to say that the Travis Bickles of 2025 are online. They're not keeping a
Yeah,
notepad.
true.
So I think it really depends on the film. I mean, um, I love many of the films you mentioned, particularly The Manchurian Candidate, and of course Lawrence of Arabia. 1962 was a great film year. In fact, a few years ago there was a book written about 1962 films. I don't remember the exact name, but you could Google it, and I'd recommend that to anyone. But I think the best films from the '70s are really from any decade. Well, some of the appearances, the hairstyles, the slang may be different, but the characters and the themes and the core of the story have an appeal that lasts for years. I was at a 50th anniversary screening of Jaws, and it was in an um, IMAX theater, and it was pretty packed, for a 50-year-old movie. So I think that I expect the same thing in 2027 with the 50th re-release of Star Wars. I think that there's a reason that people keep coming back to these films. You have a level of artistry and a level of craftsmanship that I think in some ways we're at their peak.
Well, what's interesting is Peter Biskind pointed out, and hopefully we get into that book at some point. Peter Biskind pointed out that Star Wars derailed George Lucas in one way, and another one it accomplished all his dreams because he was of the same mold as Francis Ford Coppola, wanting to make small films, and he never was able to return to that. So I always thought Star Wars is the film that kind of moved George Lucas away from his peers. And I'm not sure if it will really kind of count as a part of the output of that decade. It's more like the future of the '80s, you know?
Yeah, that's a long-standing debate, and I've read a lot of criticism making that same point that Star Wars was the end of the '70s. That may have been the result, but I think the result, if you go back and look at Star Wars, when George Lucas was making it, he had no idea that it was going to become make
Yeah.
multi-million dollars and become a huge franchise. It was a personal film based on his experiences with Saturday morning serials and Kurosawa films, his readings of Joseph Campbell and others. I think what happened is that after Star Wars, the corporate people, the studios are like, oh, let's do that. Let's just copy that and do more of that. And I think that's what led to kind of the commercialization of the 1980s. But that's not something that I think you can. Okay, I don't know why it keeps
Oh,
doing
don't
that.
worry, just keep talking. You're on a roll.
Yeah,
We'll make note of.
I don't think that's something that you could pin on Spielberg or Lucas. Close Encounters was a very personal film to to Spielberg. It had a lot of themes that really were important to him, especially at that stage in his life.
I think, um, well, it's also worth noting that in 2014, the highest grossing film of that year was Clint Eastwood's American Sniper. He probably did not think I'm going to beat Guardians of the Galaxy or Lego Movie. So yeah, you're right. You hope for the best, but sometimes you can make a very personal film that does make that kind of dent, and I think maybe that's what Steven Spielberg was trying to do with Jaws. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Um,
that's a, and that's if I could just interrupt, that's a good point. I didn't think of that. Eastwood started directing in 1971 with Play Misty for Me. So
I have seen that movie. It's a very good
yeah,
movie.
he's not listed as a 70s director the way Coppola or Scorsese or some of the others, but he literally is. That's when he started making films, and the rest is history.
Well, Eastwood signed a studio contract. I can't remember with who, but he was part of the studio era. And
Oh
also,
yeah, yeah, he came up that way,
so
and
I think he
and he
worked
had
the
and
era
later he
many
had a
guys.
long-standing relationship with Warner Brothers.
I think he even offered to direct his first film for free to sort of get his. But and actually, by the way, a lot of these people are very old. So if you're gonna do a talk for Diane Keaton and Robert Redford, you're gonna be in trouble because Eastwood is like 90 plus. I think Ridley Scott is 90. A lot of these people are, you're going to have a lot of talks coming up for some of the greats are going to be unfortunately passing away pretty soon. Unfortunately, I wish it wasn't, but um, yeah.
I mean, I hope as they say in our faith, may they live to be 120.
Um, well, I think Peter Biskin makes a very good point that the end of the era was the death of Hal Ashby. Because Hal Ashby, everything he touched in this decade turned to gold. I also have seen The Last Detail. That's also a very good film. Again, that actually does make the case that Jack Nicholson, whenever he was in a film, he was a method actor through and through. Like, I never felt like the film was short on the character whenever Jack Nicholson was in Five Easy Pieces or, even if I didn't love everything about One Out of the Cuckoo's Nest, but, because I think Peter Biskin was like, some of these guys are down and out, but they were still hoping to make comebacks. And Hal Ashby, when he's dead, he couldn't make a comeback. So that was one reason why I think it's the end of an era, because it really was the end. And he already had kind of been out of his career, and you have that hope. And the second is that all the people who were his peers reunited at the funeral or tried to, so if they had any feuds, there was all this kind of, if it was a movie or a documentary, it would be a good place to end it, was right there.
There actually is a good documentary simply called How from a
Yeah,
few years ago on his life and career. That and yeah, I mean I don't agree with everything in Biskin's book, but I thought that was a good choice because really Ashby, you could make an argument that out of all the 70s directors that he had the most consistent output for that decade.
absolutely, yeah. Um, I also going back a little bit to the 60s, I think one thing, it's whether some people love the 70s, but I think it's just important not to not to mention that to not to ignore that the 60s had a lot of this stuff when it comes to um psychological depth. I mean, I just saw Children's Hour. I just saw Collector this year, which is pretty dark, like a Silence of the Lambs kind of thing. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Lolita, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, all in the 60s, all films that kind of push the boundaries. You also had the Western was alive and kicking in this decade. I mean, John Ford was in his last years and doing some of his more mature work. You had John Sturges, you had Sam Peckinpah, and you had Sergio Leone. So I would say that genre experimentation was really kicking it. And then you had 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think there was a lot of sci-fi in this decade, but I mean. You also had the first all Asian musical, Flower Drum Song. You had Sweet Charity, which was the start of a very experimental career by Bob Fosse. It was not his most successful, box office wise, but some of the, you had a lot of, and then you had a ton of social message pictures. You mentioned Failsafe the other day. That was this decade. The Pawnbroker was also a very important film about remembering the dark side. I love Inherit the Wind. I love Ship of Fools. I love In the Heat of the Night. I love what's that one? Judgment of Nuremberg. There are just so many great quotable lines. Birdman of Alcatraz is a favorite of mine too. Um, but I know that I might be in the minority in thinking that's a better prison movie than One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I might not have gotten One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as much, but there is a lot in the '60s that I think is overlooked. If you said that like the '70s was the film that really stretched genre experimentation.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, there are incredible '60s films, and I think that some of I would agree that a lot of what we credit to the '70s got their start, at least in the late '60s. And the '60s was a very transitional decade. You had a lot of, John Ford and Howard Hawks, uh, and 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 George Cukor were all still directing films at the beginning of the '60s. In the '70s, and then by the end of the decade, you had a lot of these newer directors, and the older ones kind of step back. Um, I mean, The Manchurian Candidate, which you mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite films of all time, and
Me too, absolutely.
it was very boundary pushing. You need to remind yourself, this is 1962. This is only a few years after McCarthyism that this came out. I went back, speaking of John Frankenheimer, I went back and watched 7 Days in May
I have seen that one. It's the same
after
quality.
after January 6th,
Yeah.
and it had a whole added resonance to me seeing it after what our country had endured in real life.
Yeah, and it feels like, well, my theory is a little bit of the '70s filmmakers did a better job of mythologizing themselves. Maybe guys like Peter Bogdanovich had more time to talk about himself since he wasn't making movies, so maybe he was doing more speaking engagements. Um, and somehow I think some of these greats like John Frankenheimer or Arthur Penn, who might have gotten a little less credit for Bonnie and Clyde than Warren Beatty, some of them I think got a little bit lost in appreciation to the '70s guys. Um, I also you also do have Billy Wilder and Alfred Hitchcock doing work this decade too in the '60s as well. And I am partial to the films of Blake Edwards. I know your old friend Bill Henry didn't like him so much, but uh, I always loved the Pink Panther, The Great Race, What Did You Do in the War, Daddy with James Coburn, some of those films. There's a tremendous amount of continental and foreign films like The VIPs, Zorba the Greek, Walk Don't Run, Never on a Sunday, The Mating Game. There's a lot of them, a lot of great films. Debbie Reynolds did a bunch of good films here.
And
Also like
you mentioned Hitchcock,
yeah,
and he um, in the '50s, that was his most prosperous decade, and he could have continued into the '60s making the same films he did in the '50s, but instead he kicked off the decade with Psycho, and that was, I mean, now it's considered a classic, but that was a huge risk at the time to to do black and white, to kill off your star 40 minutes into the movie. you
yeah.
know
Well,
the
spoiler
sex and
alert.
violence were pretty cutting edge for the time, so the decade
Yeah.
even starts with someone, one of the old masters saying, let's see how far I can go.
So going back to the book, um, yeah, so I think one thing about the book is that obviously it makes these people very interesting. I think the '60s, for all we know, Sidney Lumet was not that interesting of a guy behind the scenes. I know he had a interesting daughter who ended up writing Rachel getting married, but maybe the people of the '60s just weren't very interesting to read about. So maybe that was the thing about the '70s as well.
Well,
The
so,
book certainly makes these people interesting, if nothing else.
yeah, I mean, Sidney Lumet, I think, was interesting. I mean, he started in the 50s directing live television, and his last film was in 2007. He wrote a book on directing that today is still used. You know, a lot of filmmakers working today have said that they've read that book and it's really
Yeah.
helped them. So I mean, he had a very long, you know, he had his share of misses, but he had a, you know, very long and storied career, and he fit in with both decades. You know, he was a 60s filmmaker and he was a 70s filmmaker, and he captured parts of each decade in his various films.
But he wasn't getting into temperament. He didn't have a famous temperament. He wasn't getting into knife fights or attacking people or throwing people in the pool
Not that
from
I know of.
balcony. Like Dennis Hopper. I don't know if you, how shocked you were
Yeah, yeah,
by Dennis Hopper's, I mean, scaring his wife and children. Everyone was doing drugs. There was, I mean, I think that was, I would say that Peter Biskin was a little bit gossipy. And perhaps that was part of the reason that was modus, that maybe that was part of the reason to write it was to sensationalize. What did you think about that element of the book?
I mean, I love that book, but I would agree with that criticism. It's certainly not perfect, and it does get too gossipy sometimes. It's like I don't need to know who all these directors had affairs with, or how many, or how much drugs they did. Yeah, I'm more interested in, you know, in the films they made. But you know, he Biskin wants to sell books as much as the next author, so do
I
what he
don't
had to do.
necessarily mean it as a criticism because it could be true. I think the biggest criticism is that it has been challenged by some people, including Spielberg was a particularly big saying that every word is false. I think Coppola was upset. I think Friedkin said he didn't care. I'm assuming Friedkin was probably uh maybe unpleasant on set. I have no idea.
Yeah, Friedkin, I mean, there's stories he could, you know, he would do whatever he had to do to get the shot that he wanted. And yeah, there are stories. I don't know